Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, let me introduce myself. My name is Ashley and this is HeebeeJeebeez TV. We like to talk about stuff like the paranormal, true crime, and of course, unsolved mysteries. Now, before we get into today's video, of course, just sending you guys a quick reminder to check out my TikTok. I see a lot of people coming over there from YouTube. If you like the TikTok format, you like shorter videos, I do post a lot more content over there. Short stories about the same topics, true crime, paranormal stuff, unsolved mysteries, disappearances. So if that's more your preference, go ahead and follow me over there. Same username at HeebeeJeebeez TV. I also just want to say a quick thank you to everyone that has joined me here on YouTube from TikTok. I do see my follower count growing a little bit more every day, which I am super thankful for. And it just helps me get a little bit closer to my ultimate goal. So big thank you to everyone who has chosen to subscribe. Okay, so today's story is actually quite disturbing. It is a very sad story. It involves child abuse. So if you are sensitive to that kind of stuff, just join me in the next video. It's not a big deal. So if you are sensitive to that kind of stuff, just click out of this window and join me on the next video. So this is a very sad story about how the system in America, unfortunately, actually really failed to help this little boy. And no hate towards America, but you would think living in a country that is considered to be one of the most powerful countries in the world, one of the best countries in the world, a country where people, spend their entire lives dreaming about living in, would have better resources or would have a better way, a better system of making sure these sort of things don't fall through the cracks. But it just goes to show you that, mistakes do happen, and sometimes the systems that are meant to protect us end up failing. And to make matters worse, the life of this little boy could have been saved multiple times. I'm talking about dozens of times, but for whatever reason, and we'll get into that in the story, the signs and the reports were often ignored or just dismissed. As we go through the story, you'll see that the people that actually cared for this little boy did everything they possibly could, aside from basically kidnapping him for his own safety. But at a certain point, you can't go any further because then you're technically breaking the law and then you're putting so many more risk factors into the situation. So it was definitely a very difficult situation to be in for everyone involved. And if that's not enough to make you upset or to just make you think a little bit deeper about what is wrong with the system, the person that did this to this little boy was his own father. And on top of that, his father was a police officer with the NYPD. So now not only do we have to be weary of the systems that are meant to protect us, but now we also have to watch our back when it comes to the people that are placed at such a high level in society that, they take an oath to protect us. They take a lot of responsibility when they wear that uniform and that badge. And, we trust them with our life because that's what we're told they are there for. And it's a really sad and frustrating situation when certain people, not all of them, but certain people choose to use that power for absolute evil. So my goal with this story is to really bring the story to the forefront. I know it's gotten quite a lot of press in the United States, but to be honest, I live in Canada and I had not heard about this story at all. And I was quite surprised considering how public it had become. But my goal with this story is to bring attention to situations like this because all it takes is for one person to speak up, especially when you see a situation like this happening. The life of a child could literally depend on whether you choose to say something or not. So the video today is going to be about the life and death of 8-year-old Thomas Valva. So little Thomas was born in 2012 to his father, Michael Valva, his mother, Justina Zubko Valva. The couple also had 2 other boys, Andrew and Anthony. Surprisingly though, as I was starting to research this case, I was not able to find certain details that I would normally find quite easily when it comes to other cases. For example, I was not able to find the exact birth dates of the children, even Thomas's birthday, I was not able to find it. So keep in mind that while there is a lot of information in the story, there might be some details that I would have preferred to have had in this video, but I just wasn't able to find them. So just keep in mind that I did do quite a lot of research on this story, but it is what it is. I wish I would have had them, but we'll continue. So Justina was an immigrant from Poland, and she ended up marrying Michael. Like I said, he was a police officer with the NYPD, and they had a home in Long Island, New York, with their 3 children. Soon after Thomas was born, his parents realized that he was actually autistic. And if you don't know what that means, essentially you grow up having a lot of social problems, a lot of social interaction issues. You have a hard time making contact, a hard time making friends. People with autism are also known to have a very short temper when, their way of doing things gets disrupted. And in their family, Thomas wasn't the only one that was diagnosed with autism. His brother Anthony was also diagnosed. To get ahead of his diagnosis, Justina, Thomas's mother, had hired a speech pathologist named Kim Taylor to work with Thomas on his speech when he was turning 2 years old. And I couldn't find whether or not Anthony had gotten this same help or not. I'm hoping he did. So as Thomas is learning to talk, both his mother and the speech pathologist Kim remember very clearly his first words. They were ball and go. And during this moment, they both said that all 3 of them were extremely happy that Thomas was talking. It was a very big moment for Thomas. Both his mother and Kim said that everyone was extremely happy, and Thomas had a huge smile on his face. Kim also noted that Justina was a very dedicated mother to Thomas, but not just him, to all her children. She loved them very, very much. She was very much involved in their lives. She participated in the speech classes. She wanted what was best for them, and there was simply no denying that. The boys also loved their mother, and that was also very clear to Kim. Unfortunately, the same thing could not be said about Michael. Whenever Kim would go to their house for their lessons together, Michael would just kind of be off doing his own thing. He was never involved in the classes. He seemed quite uninterested in Thomas's progress. And for the most part, Kim would just have a cordial hello and goodbye, and then he would go off and do his own thing. Which brings us to the next section. What do we know about Michael? What do we know about Thomas's father? Well, from what I found online, there was a Reddit forum talking about this case, and some people seem to have known this guy in high school, and a lot of them were saying that he was kind of like a douche. Basically, that guy that is super cocky, full of himself. He's kind of mean, but somehow he's still popular. I'm sure we all knew someone like that in high school, but essentially that's how they described him when he was younger. Eventually, he would grow up to become a police officer in the NYPD, and he was working in the Transit Bureau in District 30. So the following year, Justina and Michael got involved in a nasty divorce, and it resulted in Michael surprisingly accusing Justina of being abusive towards the boys. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what happened. That hasn't been made very public yet, but from what I've read, it's implied that Michael was the true abuser before all of these things started happening. So initially during the divorce, Justina had actually been given custody of the boys, with Michael having visitation rights, except he wasn't allowed to have overnight visitation with the boys. And this resulted from Justina actually compiling and putting together quite a lot of evidence on a USB stick that, helped her build a case against Michael, because she said that he was extremely abusive, not only towards her, but towards the children as well. A few examples of the evidence on this USB stick were stories of Michael taking photos of his private parts and then sending them to women while the boys were literally in the bed with him, watching him do this. And there was also documents of him being extremely verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, and of course, physically as well. Michael, when he found out about this, was absolutely not happy, and he wasn't going to let Justina get away with it. And, Justina was also at a disadvantage. She was not making the same amount of money that Michael was, so he was able to hire a lawyer as the proceedings and their divorce continued, while Justina was kind of forced to represent herself. Sadly, this resulted in Justina losing custody of all of the boys on September 6, 2017. A judge by the name of Hope Schwartz Zimmerman unlawfully and without any due process or any supporting evidence or documents against Justina somehow awarded Michael temporary custody of all 3 boys. So in the court documents and in a bunch of news articles online, Justina was trying to understand why the judge would award Michael custody of the 3 boys when she had presented all of this evidence to the prior judge. So of course, Justina was completely shocked at this ruling. And so when she's trying to understand why this would happen, why a judge would award Michael custody over her, the judge simply replied, "Because I said so." But that wasn't it. Judge Zimmerman actually refused to have a hearing to further look into the evidence that Justina was referring to. And she actually went as far as to completely bar Justina from seeing her children at all. Basically, Judge Zimmerman had been convinced by not only Michael's lawyer, but by the lawyer that was assigned to the children in order to, fight for their best interest, that she was the actual abuser and that the kids would have been much safer with Michael, even though none of that was true. So shortly after she had lost custody of her 3 children, Justina was able to hire a lawyer for a short period of time in order to, fight this judgment and potentially try to get her kids back. So when this lawyer was arguing with the judge and presenting their case, they focused on the fact that the judge had initially overstepped their ruling, that they shouldn't have made this decision. And when Judge Zimmerman was presented with this, she basically just replied, "I don't think I did." Now, there has been quite a lot of outrage regarding this judge's ruling and their thought process because it just doesn't make any sense. And because of this judge, what happens next in the story was a direct result from that judge's decision. I've even seen some petitions floating around trying to get Judge Zimmerman disbarred, but I'm not entirely sure about the progress on that at the moment. But if you guys are interested, you could easily Google them and they'll pop up for you. Justina would also go on to say that she believes that Judge Zimmerman was kind of blinded by Justina's immigrant status. She was from Poland, so she thinks that that could have likely had a role in the decision, that she probably didn't think that Justina was capable of being a fit mother for one of those reasons. Now, after that court battle, it's not exactly clear when this happened, but at some point in 2017, Michael ended up dating someone new. He had gotten himself a new girlfriend. Her name is Angela Polina, and she actually also had 3 other daughters from another relationship. But by 2017, her and her 3 daughters were living in Michael at his home in Long Island. She was also involved in the disgusting events that we'll discuss later on, but I just wanted to get an introduction into who she was now before the story gets a little bit more complicated later on. So right after the custody judgment was passed down, Justina tried contacting the school where all the boys were attending in order to, provide them with the evidence of abuse so they could potentially report it to CPS on her behalf. The school then started tracking any evidence that they could see on Thomas that, could have potentially been signs of abuse. And at one point, according to court documents, it said that they saw clear, irrefutable proof that Tommy had been physically beaten and abused by Mr. Valva, with severe bruising in his lower spine and buttocks area. And Justina actually made a Facebook group, and it's still there now, where you can see all of the things that she was posting on there. And the school psychologist had actually written a letter documenting some of these things. And in summary, the psychologist said that she did not think that Michael or Angela Polina fully understood the depth of Tommy's autism. Both Tommy and his brother Anthony had lost a significant amount of weight that school year, and that both of the boys would constantly come to school hungry. When they were asked why, they would say it was because they weren't given breakfast or they had gotten into trouble, which resulted in them not being able to eat. Both Thomas and Anthony were also said to have been terrified of going to the nurse, and when they were asked why they were having this reaction, they told the teachers that it was because their father and Angela told them that they were not allowed to go see the nurse. And one can only assume that they told the kids not to go see the nurse because they didn't want anyone to see the signs of abuse they were suffering. The boys were also said to have started coming to school extremely dirty, wearing very old raggedy clothes, wearing smelly clothes, and they even started showing up to school in diapers. Considering their age, this was completely abnormal. And Thomas actually started having toilet accidents. He started urinating on himself, even though he had had no previous history of doing this. In the court documents, the school continued to track all of the signs of abuse. And one time, the school principal noticed something odd about Thomas's eye. He said that it was bruised and his right eye was extremely swollen. And of course, he asks Thomas what happened, but Thomas simply couldn't keep his story straight. He kept changing and coming up with different ways to try to explain this away. So of course, the principal would call Thomas's father and he would basically give them lip service, telling them that it was an accident, or he would change the stories and he would apologize, but essentially he would brush it off. With all of this information and all of these reports and sightings, the school didn't finally report anything to CPS until September 2018, which was an entire year after the boys had been awarded custody to Michael. When Michael heard about this, he completely flipped out and he tried to turn it all on Justina once again, saying that she was the abusive parent and that she was actually trying to poison the kids with a toxic brown medicine. But of course, Justina wasn't just going to let him do this to her, so she provided CPS with another USB stick that had tons of proof that Michael was actually the abusive parent. And in the USB stick, there were a bunch of recordings, and I'm not exactly sure how she was able to get this. I wasn't able to find that information. But essentially, there were recordings of Michael brainwashing the children, telling them to chant things like, "I don't love mommy," or "Mommy is mean," and "I don't want to stay with mommy." And then he would just continue and encourage the boys to say it louder and louder. On January 18th, 2019, the students had actually returned to school from a long weekend. Thomas had actually gone up to his teacher and told her that he was extremely hungry and that he had not had any food at all the previous day, which was a Monday. He also ended up telling her that his heart was beating really, really strongly, and this was probably because his body was working on overdrive, just trying to work on keeping him alive at this point. On February 27, 2019, the school filed a report with CPS reiterating the weight loss of both of the boys, but especially Anthony's. In that report, they also stated that Anthony came to school soaked in urine. His clothes reeked of urine and they were just completely drenched on it, and he was shivering as well. And so of course the teachers ask Anthony what happened, and he tells them that he had been forced to stand in the garage for an unknown amount of time. And keep in mind that this is February, it is in the middle of winter, and February and January are considered to be the coldest months of the year. In March 2019, 3 teachers filed 4 more reports with CPS describing more disturbing stories coming from Anthony. When Michael found out about this, he tried to get the boys to switch schools, but thankfully he was denied. From there, Anthony's behavior started changing, and it started with him refusing to get off the school bus. And whenever teachers would approach him or try to get him to get off, he would start screaming and kicking. But eventually they were able to convince him to get off the bus. And of course, they started asking him why he was acting this way. And he tells them that his father and Angela told him to do it. He also said that they told him that if he did this, that they would reward him with Chuck E. Cheese. So basically, this little boy was being coached to misbehave. On a separate day, after his teachers had successfully convinced Anthony to get off of the school bus, he gets off and he goes up to them and tells them that he's extremely hungry. He tells them that he didn't have any breakfast that morning, and so his teachers ask him why. Like, why would you not have any breakfast? And then he tells them it's because he was on the mattress. What that actually meant is that his father had placed a mattress in the garage, and whenever any of the boys would misbehave, he would basically just make them stay on the mattress in the garage for an unknown amount of time. And sometimes this was even reported lasting up to weeks, and he would basically starve the boys. He would torture them. He would not let them have access to warmth. They couldn't bathe. They barely ate. And keep in mind that this is all still happening in the middle of winter. On May 19, 2019, another teacher reported to CPS because she had noticed a very large bruise, and it was actually so swollen it was raising off of Thomas's forehead. This was actually discovered to be a result of Michael actually throwing Thomas's school bag so hard at his face that it left a huge mark on him. And he also told this teacher that his hand was in a lot of pain. And when they asked him why, he said it was because his father has squeezed his hand really, really hard after he had had a urine accident. On June 7, 2019, the school filed another report with CPS, and this time it was because Anthony arrived to the school with dried blood all over his nostrils, and there were a lot of cuts on his nose. So the teacher obviously tries to get Anthony to go to the school nurse, but as soon as she suggests that, he starts kicking and screaming. So she calls Michael at home to ask him what happened, and he tells her that Anthony had woken up with a bloody nose that morning. He also then proceeded to completely brush off the questions regarding the cuts on Anthony's nose. The teacher then tells Michael if he could please talk to his son and to convince him to go to the school nurse because he clearly needed some sort of medical attention. So that's when Angela grabs the phone from Michael and starts talking to Anthony, and she tells him that he should go to the boys' bathroom by himself, clean it up, and that if his nose kept bleeding, then he should go to the nurse. On November 16, 2019, there were text messages that were exchanged, and these were later revealed in court. And it basically proved that the issue of the urine accidents, the boys having these peeing accidents, was a very big issue for Michael. After he discovered that the boys had peed on themselves, he ended up texting Angela saying, "I'll beat them up again. Talking don't work. Maybe a bloody face will. He already peed, no problem. I'll be kicking his ass again. Tell him I'm going to kick their ass again. Like I said, I'm going to hit them with a belt." Absolutely insane behavior for a father. On November 19, 2019, two more teachers filed another report with CPS, and this time it was because Anthony had gotten to school with a cut on his eye and a bruised ear. Thomas also showed up to school that day with a pretty big cut on his forehead, and when the teachers asked the boys what happened, they said it was because they were playing football and they had gotten hurt. The teachers also noticed that the boys were increasingly getting hungrier and hungrier, and that they basically looked like they were emaciated. And whenever they had the opportunity to get food, of course, they would wolf it down. And it was so sad to watch. These little boys hadn't had enough food for God knows how long that whenever they did get food, they would be literally licking every last crumb. On that particular day, the teachers also noticed that Thomas and Anthony always got a lot less food than their brother Andrew, who actually happened to be not autistic. Now, if we backtrack a little, going back to March 6, 2018, Justina had successfully received a court order that allowed her to have unsupervised visits with her children. And this was without any restrictions as well. And because Michael was denying her or making it extremely difficult for her to see her children, she kept trying to arrange these visits with the school so she can see her boys. And she even brought the documents to prove to the school that she was permitted to see them. But the school just kept denying her for no reason. As you can imagine by this point, Justina was completely going insane. She was running out of options. She had absolutely no idea what to do to get someone to believe her that her children were in danger. Not only was the school filing all of these CPS reports, but so was Justina. So it makes you ask the question, what was CPS doing with all of these reports? Well, it was discovered that CPS would actually close most of these reports the very next day without actually looking into them. Then January came along and Thomas showed up to school looking extremely frail and it was said that his hands and his face were extremely red as well. Then came the fateful day of January 17th, 2020. A call came in to 911 from Michael Valva's home saying they needed an ambulance because a child had fallen on the driveway and had hit their head. When police arrived to the home, they saw Michael in the basement trying to give Thomas CPR, and he just repeated the same story to them, but it was noted that he showed basically zero emotion. He didn't seem like a distraught parent at all. So the ambulance, they take Thomas to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Immediately after Thomas died, Michael went back home and started a GoFundMe page in order to raise money for Thomas's funeral. And on that page, he was said to have been, pretending to be this grieving father who was completely distraught that his son had just passed away. And he was basically trying to fool everyone into giving him money to pay for the funeral costs. And it actually worked for him. He was able to raise $10,000 in just one day. And in that message, he had also said that him and Angela would be fully responsible for handling the funds and that people should not send any sort of floral arrangements because funds were much more preferred. But back at the hospital, while Thomas's body was still there, the medical examiner noticed that Michael's story about what happened was not making sense with what he was finding when he was looking at Thomas's body. Thomas didn't die from a fall. Thomas had actually died from hypothermia. So of course they alert the police, and police start looking a lot closer at Michael and at his home. And that's when they discovered that he actually had quite an intense security system at the house. When they started looking, they discovered that he had a camera feed going from inside the house towards the garage, and it was filming inside the garage, and it was labeled as kids' room. So, that is a weird thing to call your garage, which ended up prompting the police officers to look a little bit further. When they looked back at the footage, they rewinded back to January 15th, and that's where they discovered a heartbreaking video. And essentially, it was a video of Thomas and Anthony being forced to sleep in the freezing garage without a mattress, without any blankets. There was no heat, there was no pillows, there was essentially absolutely nothing to keep these two little boys warm. And it was believed that Thomas and Anthony were both forced to sleep there the following night again. And on that particular night, the temperature had gone down to 19 degrees Fahrenheit or -7 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cold. When police looked at the footage from the day of Thomas's death, they discovered something extremely disturbing. And on the footage, there's a clip of Michael basically mocking Thomas over and over again for constantly falling on the floor. And this recording was also played in court. And you can hear Michael saying, "Boo effing who," when Thomas would fall. This little boy was basically so weak and so hypothermic at that point that he could barely stand up anymore. And he just kept falling over and over. And instead of helping him and instead of being a father figure and a protective person and just the person that's supposed to protect you from everything in life, his father just stood there, laughed at him, and mocked him. Then there's another portion of the clip where you can hear the other children saying what's wrong with Thomas. They were asking questions because they knew what they were seeing was not normal. And then that's when you hear Angela step in. And she says he's hypothermic and that's what happens when you're washed with cold water and it's freezing, you get hypothermia. So what had actually happened is that Thomas had urinated on himself again. And of course, this had pissed off Michael tremendously. So much so to the point that he forced Thomas to undress. He took him into the backyard and basically hosed him down outside in the middle of winter. Then he forced this little boy to go sleep in the garage. Angela then proceeds to ask Michael what he was going to do with Thomas, to which he replies, "I'm effing suffocating him. That's what I'm doing." In another clip, just an hour before Thomas died, Michael can be heard yelling at him, "God damn you, get up, get up, get up, you effing slob, get up." And then in some last-ditch attempt to save Thomas's life, I guess he had some sort of change of heart or a guilty conscience, Michael tries to put Thomas in a warm bath to resuscitate him, but by that time it was way too late. I can only imagine what this little boy must have been thinking throughout these moments of intense abuse, him probably being extremely confused as to why his father was doing this to him. You know, your father is supposed to be the one person in the world that is there to protect you no matter what, but to literally be bullied and tortured and basically murdered by your own father for absolutely no reason, it must have been so confusing to this little boy, not knowing what to do, who to even reach out to. Then on January 24th, 2020, police arrested both Michael and Angela for the murder of Thomas. And of course, as you can imagine, both of them pled not guilty. Angela's daughters were thankfully removed from Angela's custody and they were given to their father. And Andrew and Anthony were finally removed from Michael's custody and were given back to their mother, Justina. Throughout the trial, Michael did not waste any time turning against Angela, that she was actually the one responsible for the way he was treating his sons. He said that she hated them so much. She didn't like that they were autistic and that they were a nuisance, and basically that she was controlling and manipulating him into abusing his children. It took years, but just this November 4th, 2022, Michael Valva was found guilty of murdering Thomas and child endangerment of Anthony and Andrew. He hasn't been actually sentenced yet since the judgment was just passed down, but he is expecting to face 25 years to life in prison. After the verdict was handed down, Michael's lawyer actually had a very weird way of trying to defend him. He actually said that while Michael had parental deficiencies, which is an interesting way of saying that they were an abusive parent, he said that even though he had these deficiencies, he did not want Thomas to die. And I know lawyers get paid to defend all sorts of people, but just trying to make some sort of justification for what happened in this situation is completely insane. Now, when it comes to why this happened, why did Thomas and Anthony have to go through this? It's not fully understood. There hasn't been a confession as to why they did this to them. But I mean, I guess you could assume or presume that this was done because they were both autistic, especially when you look at their other brother, Andrew, who was not autistic. He didn't have to suffer the abuse that these two other little boys did, and neither did Angela's daughters. As for Angela, she was just as guilty in this entire thing. She could have picked up the phone and called 911 at any given point. She could have helped these boys. She could have taken them back to their mother. She could have done anything, basically. And as for her, her trial is set to begin in January 2023. And that's where the case stands today. I know there are still a few things developing. We'll wait to see what happens with Angela's case, but I'm assuming it's going to go the same way Michael's did. She will be found guilty of at least something. But that's it for today's case, guys. If you guys like this video, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. And don't forget to check out my TikTok at HeebeeJeebeez TV for a lot more true crime, paranormal, and unsolved mystery content. But that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, guys, and I will see you in the next one.